So good day class, let's have a quick review of the concept of homeostasis. Now when we speak of homeostasis, homeostasis basically is a very important process that occur in all living organisms. And as we know, all organ systems must work together in order to achieve homeostasis, or simply means maintaining balance or steady state. The ability of an organism to maintain its internal environment or the maintenance of balance despite changes to its internal or external environment again is really important, no, for the survival of the organism. Alright, and again, homeostasis, as I have mentioned earlier, is defined as the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment or the maintenance of balance or steady state. But again, it does not mean that composition, temperature, and other characteristics are absolutely unchanging. Or we can say that homeostasis is essential, like what I mentioned earlier, for the survival and functioning of all the cells. Each cell contributes to the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment. So that is our concept of homeostasis. So to give you an example of how cells contribute to the maintenance of a relatively stable internal environment, let's consider the following. So we have here a table showing normal ranges for some blood set point values. So this simply means that our cells must maintain the following. It must maintain balance. So any lack or excess of these values will be detrimental to the survival of the organism. Like for example, in our case, our arterial pH value must range between 7.35 to 7.45. So meaning our blood is neutral. Our blood is neither acidic, lower than 7, or basic, higher than 7. Now, if there are cases that our pH levels would decrease or increase, our cells must maintain this normal set point values of 7.35 to 7.45. So, dapat ma-maintain ng mga cells natin itong pH value ng dugo natin. Another example would be the level of bicarbonate in our blood. So, ang normal set point value is between 24 to 28 milliliters of blood. So, dapat ma-maintain natin yung set point values na yan. So, any lack or excess of bicarbonate will be detrimental to the survival of the cell. So, the job of our cells is to maintain this set point value of 24 to 28. Okay, another example is the amount of oxygen or the oxygen content of our blood. So, the oxygen content must range between 17.2 to 22 ml per 100 liter of blood. So, any excess, or let's say if the oxygen content is low, then the job of the cells is to maintain these set point values for the oxygen content in our blood. Same thing with urea. The normal set point value is between 12 to 35 milligram per 100 ml of blood. So our cells, our body tissues must maintain this level of urea. Any excess or any lack of urea may be detrimental to the cell. So dapat ma-maintain tong normal set point value for urea in our blood between 12 to 35 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So for example, tumaas yung urea. So dapat ma-maintain yan. No? Dapat bumaba yung level of urea. So that's homeostasis. Alright, another example would be the amount of amino acids present in our blood. So the normal set point values is between 3.3 to 5.1 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So in cases that the amino acid levels would increase or decrease, the cells must act to maintain this set point value of 3.3 to 5.1 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. Same thing with proteins. So the normal set point values for proteins in our blood is between 6.5 to 8 grams per 100 ml of blood. So dapat ma-maintain yan, yung set point value na yan. Total lipids in our blood is between 400 to 800 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. Right? So pag tumaas yung lipid level, triglycerides, ayan, so that means bawasan nyo ng kumain ng mga fatty foods, something like that. So our cells must maintain that normal set point values, or else any increase or decrease may affect the survival of the organism. And lastly, we have the amount of glucose. Okay, or yung sugar level ng dugo natin, it must be between 75 to 110 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So pag tumaas yung glucose levels, yan, baka maging diabetic kayo. So our cells must act in order to lower down the glucose content to dun sa normal set point values, no, between 75 to 110 milligrams of blood. Now same thing, pag bumaba yung glucose level, so there must be a mechanism para tumaas ulit, no, ma-maintain yung normal range na ito of 75 to 110 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So basically that's the concept of homeostatic balance. So class, what is the point of all of this? Why do we need to know the normal ranges for some of the components of the blood, the normal set point values? Now the reason for this is because in the maintenance of homeostatic balance in our blood, homeostasis involves several dynamic mechanisms that can detect and respond to deviations or changes in physiological variables from their set point values by initiating effector responses that, take note, restore the changes or variables to their optimal physiological range. So ang ibig lang sabihin nito, what I meant there is, for example, arterial pH must be maintained to 7.35 to 7.45. Any changes or any deviation from the normal set point values will affect the survival of the organism. So the cells must have a mechanism, physiological mechanism, that in case there are changes or deviation from the normal arterial pH, these mechanisms must restore the normal set point values. So pag tumaas yung pH or bumaba yung pH, there must be a mechanism in the cells para ma-restore yung normal set point value. For example, for pH, ma-restore yung 7.35 to 7.45. Same thing with, for example, the oxygen content in our blood. So any deviation or changes from, let's say, 17, tumaas yung oxygen content or bumaba, there must be some mechanisms na magre-restore back to its normal or optimal physiological set point values. Na, for example, for oxygen content, it's 17.2 to 22 ml per 100 ml of blood. Same thing with lipids. No? Kunyari, mahilig kayong kumain ng mga fatty foods like lechon. So, definitely tataas yung lipid content, no, to higher than 800 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. So ang gagawin ng mga cells, may mga mechanisms sa cells that will restore no, yung mga deviations na yan to its optimal physiological value. So ibabalik yan sa normal optimal range of 400 to 800 milligrams per 100 ml of blood. Same thing with glucose. Kunyari mahilig kayo sa soft drink or mahilig kayo sa mga sweets like candies, gano'n. So tataas yung glucose level, yung sugar level ng blood natin. Higher than 110. Minsan tumataas pa yan to 300 milligrams per 100 ml of blood pag mahilig kayo sa mga sweets, soft drinks, gano'n. So may mga mechanisms sa cells na magpapababa ng glucose levels. Like for example, the secretion of insulin because insulin regulates the amount of glucose in our blood. So parang gano'n. So may mga set of mechanisms that will restore, no, yung changes na yan or deviation to its optimal physiological set point value. So yun ang ibig sabihin nito, that homeostasis involves dynamic mechanisms that detect and respond to deviations in physiological variables from their set point values, no, by initiating effector responses. Like for example, pag tumaas yung blood sugar level natin, yung pancreas natin will be triggered to produce insulin, to lower the blood sugar. Alright? Para ma-restore, to restore the variables or changes to its optimal physiological range. So that's our concept of homeostasis. So class 2 continue, there are two main body systems that are involved in the maintenance of balance. So we have the nervous system and the endocrine system. So we will have a detailed discussion on how the nervous system and the endocrine system maintains balance. Now this is true for higher organisms, but for primitive organisms or simple organisms like the amoeba and seaweeds, which are members of kingdom Protista, so these simple aquatic organisms, they can obtain their food, maintain water balance and oxygen through simple diffusion, and they can also remove waste materials also via the cell membrane through simple diffusion. So that's how homeostasis works for very simple organisms like the amoeba. So they can maintain balance through simple diffusion. And in the case of water balance, the amoeba has a very special organelle called the contractile vacuole that removes excess water. So again, take note, the amoeba lives in a hypotonic solution. So water enters the cell. So to prevent the cell from swelling and eventually bursting, the contractile vacuole removes the excess water to maintain the water balance in the cell. Alright, now for higher organisms, there are special mechanisms involved to maintain internal conditions or homeostatic balance. Now in the case of waste products must be removed. Like in the case of carbon dioxide is a byproduct of metabolism that must be removed. So carbon dioxide is removed via the respiratory system, via the lungs, through our exhalation of air. As we exhale, carbon dioxide returns to the external environment. Now for urea also is a byproduct of metabolism. So urea produced by the liver that breaks down amino acids is removed by our kidneys and then transferred to our urinary bladder. Now, what about the maintenance of internal conditions? Now, let's say for example, the regulation of body temperature. So, the regulation of body temperature is done by the skin. So, the skin performs that function of regulating our body temperature either by producing sweat. So, sweating through evaporative cooling helps lower down our temperature. Now, the body shivers because, as we know by principle, that muscle contraction produces body heat. And this is true, let's say, if the body needs to be warmed because the temperature outside is low. So that's how the body regulates temperature. Now, the regulation of ion content, like for example, if there is an increase or decrease in sodium or potassium ion content, then we maintain that by eating. So let's say if the potassium content is low, then we increase it by eating bananas. Alright? Or for example, if there's too much sodium, then we can remove excess sodium also by sweating. Alright, and also through our kidneys, no? Certain ions can be removed via the kidneys and through urinating. Alright, water content, same thing. If there is a decrease in the water content in our body, then we increase that by drinking. So kung dehydrated tayo, syempre we have to drink to increase our water content. Or if there's too much water in our body, that must be regulated by sweating, because sweating also removes excess water, and also by urinating. So that's the job of the kidneys and the bladder. Alright? And also, for example, ito, paborito ko to, yung glucose content, yung amount of sugar. Alright? So let's say if the sugar level increases, then our body produces insulin. Yan, mga hormones yan, insulin, to lower down the blood sugar content. Okay, same thing din. Pag if there's a decrease in blood sugar, then our body produces these hormones. Okay? Basta ma-maintain lang yung normal set point values that I mentioned earlier. So class, in relation to this, as I mentioned earlier, there are two body systems involved in the maintenance of homeostasis. We have the nervous system and the endocrine system. So the nervous system basically controls and coordinates bodily functions or activities that require, take note, rapid responses. Yung pang mabilisan ang response kaagad, no? Detects and initiates reactions to changes in external environment. So yung mga changes or deviations in the environment, magre-respond kagad ang ating katawan through the nervous system. That's why I mentioned here that our nervous system can detect and initiate fast reactions, no, to changes in the external environment. Now for the endocrine system, this involves the secretion of glands. So may mga glands sa katawan natin that secretes hormones. And these hormones, they regulate activities that require duration rather than speed. No, ang speed sa nervous system, pero ang endocrine system medyo mabagal yan, because these hormones must travel via the circulatory system and hahanapin pa niya yung target. So medyo mabagal lang siya ng konti. No? It requires duration rather than speed. Controls concentration of nutrients, and by adjusting kidney functions, controls internal environments, volume, and electrolyte composition. So yun yung nire-regulate ng ating endocrine system, like the concentration of nutrients, like glucose na lang, di ba? Like I mentioned earlier. So glucose concentrations can be regulated by secreting insulin, hormone yan, no? By the pancreas. Alright? By adjusting kidney functions, no? May mga glands that sees to it na yung kidney nagpa-function properly. Alright? Electrolyte composition, yan, nire-regulate din ng mga hormones yan. So that's the job of the endocrine system in maintaining homeostasis. So again class, we need to answer what are the factors that are homeostatically regulated. Ano yung mga nire-regulate ng katawan natin through homeostasis? So again, what are the factors that are homeostatically regulated? So class, this includes the following. So we have the concentration of nutrient molecules, like what I mentioned, yung walang kamatayan na glucose level. Ayan, so if our glucose levels would increase or decrease, dapat ma-regulate yan homeostatically. Alright, by the secretion of hormones. Also, we have the concentration of water, salt, and other electrolytes. No? They must be regulated homeostatically, lalo na yung concentration of salt and electrolytes. Right? So any decrease or increase will affect the organism. Also water, di ba? So if there is a decrease or increase in the water content, will affect the organism. Especially pag dehydrated tayo, dapat we have to drink water. Alright, another factor that is regulated homeostatically would be the concentration of waste products, and very important to, like for example carbon dioxide. O pag nag-i-increase yung carbon dioxide sa dugo natin, naku, this is detrimental. So dapat ma-remove yung carbon dioxide via our respiratory system. Or for example again, yung urea. So if the amount of urea increases, that must be eliminated, no, via the kidney. So very important that the concentration of these waste products like carbon dioxide and urea must be homeostatically regulated. Okay? Also, we have the concentration of oxygen. Naku, very important yan, class. So our oxygen levels must be at least 100 millimeters of mercury, and yung carbon dioxide level medyo dapat mas mababa yan, no? 40 milligrams of mercury. So dapat mataas yung oxygen as compared to the level of carbon dioxide, no? So dapat ma-regulate yung dalawang ito, no? Yung oxygen dapat mataas, syempre yung oxygen level kasi ginagamit ng cells natin ng oxygen. Oxygen is a major metabolic component, no, ng mga cells natin, and ang nilalabas is carbon dioxide. So syempre dapat mas mababa yung carbon dioxide level, or yan, dapat mas mababa pa sa 40 millimeters of mercury. Alright? Okay, so dapat mabalanse, no? Homeostatically regulated siya. Alright, the pH level of our blood must also be maintained at least nasa neutral range na 7.35. So pag bumaba yung pH, magiging acidic yung dugo natin and nakakasama yan sa katawan. No? Or pag tumaas yung pH level, magiging alkaline yung dugo natin, mas makakasama din. So dapat ma-maintain yung pH level to its optimal physiological range. Yung sinabi ko kanina doon sa table. No? So the amount of pH must be homeostatically regulated. Alright, blood volume must be between 4 to 6 liters of blood. No? And yung blood pressure natin must be 120/80. No, yan, di ba? So pag tumaas yung blood pressure natin, masama yan. No? Masama yan sa kidneys. Pag tumaas yung blood pressure natin, baka we have the greater risk of having stroke. Diba? So dapat bumaba yung pressure. Pag tumaas yung blood pressure natin, there must be a mechanism na bababa siya ulit, no? Para ma-maintain yung normal, optimal physiological range. Alright? So, yan. And temperature. Diba? Sa balat natin, the temperature is regulated by the skin. So, temperature must be maintained to at least 37 degrees Celsius. O kaya kahit 36, diba? 37 parang may lagnat na ata yan, no? Kasi tinitignan niya, di ba, sa mga pagpupunta kayo ng mall, di ba, may parang temperature monitor yung ginaganon na parang infrared. Na yung 37, mainit na yan. At least mga 36, no? 35, ganyan. So our skin regulates temperature either through sweating and the dilation and constriction of blood vessels. Alright? And so these are the factors that must be regulated homeostatically. So class, to continue about the control of homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is continually being disrupted by either external or internal conditions in the body of an organism. So external stimuli that can disrupt homeostasis may include changes in temperature like heat or cold, or lack of oxygen, the presence of pathogenic agents, and toxic substances. Now, what about internal stimuli that may disrupt homeostatic balance? So we have changes in body temperature, changes in blood pressure, changes in the concentration of water, glucose, salts, and oxygen, and even physical and psychological distresses may disrupt our homeostatic balance. And these disruptions can be mild to severe. And if homeostasis is not maintained, kunyari nagkaroon ng changes in body temperature or the presence of oxygen, and if that is not maintained, hindi bumalik sa kanyang normal set point value sa pinakita ko kanina, this may result to diseases and worse, death. So here is an example to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So for example, all organisms had the ability to maintain balance or homeostasis, and there are disruptions. This maintenance of balance is disrupted by external factors and internal changes or factors. So these factors may result in the loss of homeostasis. So pag may disruptions, no, either external or internal, may disrupt homeostatic balance. Okay? So kunyari tumaas yung glucose level, no, ng dugo, or tumaas yung blood pressure. So this may disrupt homeostatic balance. So organisms must attempt to compensate, no, dapat ma-normalize, no? They have to compensate dun sa pagtaas or pagbaba ng mga external or internal changes na to. Now, if the organism cannot maintain homeostasis, it may lead to death or diseases. Now, if the organism can compensate, or pag nag-normalize yung na-disrupt na changes, edi that will result to the wellness of the organism. So that is very important. Homeostasis is crucial in the survival of the organism. So class, ang tanong ngayon, how do we achieve wellness? Dapat hindi tayo pumunta dun sa compensation fails, because if the organism cannot compensate, hindi may ma-normalize yung changes or deviations to the normal set point values, that will lead to illness or the worst, kamatayan. So ang tanong ngayon, how do we achieve wellness? Now, in order to maintain homeostasis, para hindi tayo magkasakit, or worse, para hindi tayo mamatay, control systems in our body, especially yung nervous and endocrine systems of our body, must be able to, number one, take note class, detect deviations or changes from the normal set point values in the internal conditions and even in the external conditions of the environment that need to be held within narrow limits. So dapat na-detect itong mga changes or deviations from the normal, either external or yung internal conditions of the environment. Number two, our control system must be able to integrate this information with other relevant information. Kaya yung mga body systems natin, they are coordinating with one another para they can start maintaining homeostatic balance. And yung mga control systems sa katawan natin must make appropriate adjustments in order to restore yung normal set values na nabanggit natin kanina dun sa table. Yan, to restore factors to its desired value. Alright, everybody, can you take a look at this diagram? So the best example to illustrate this would be the regulation of body temperature. So sa skin natin, may mga receptors, no, that can detect changes in body temperature. Alright, so dadaan yan either sa nervous system, no, especially yung nervous system natin. So ang nervous system is one of the control centers ng katawan natin. Alright, so with that, our nervous system will command yung mga effectors. Like for example, uminit, no? Sa external condition, external environment, uminit siya. So our receptors sa skin natin will detect the changes in temperature, yung pagkainit ng external environment. Then yung information na yan dadaan dun sa control center, dun sa ating nervous system. So our nervous system will process the information that was transmitted by the receptors ng skin natin. Then our nervous system will send commands or information dun sa effectors, no? Let's say muscles ng mga blood vessels. So basically yung effector will initiate yung response. So pag mainit, our muscles sa mga blood vessels will start to dilate, magdadilate yung mga blood vessels natin. in order to remove excess heat. Para ma-maintain yung homeostasis, ma-normalize or ma-restore dun sa normal temperature, which is either 35 to 36 degrees Celsius. O same thing, yung opposite naman, pag malamig sa external environment, that will be detected by the receptors of the skin. The information is sent to the control center, which is the nervous system. Then the nervous system will process the information, then magsesend ng commands or instructions yung ating nervous system to the effectors dun sa muscles ng mga blood vessels natin in order for the blood vessels to constrict, no? Constrict siya ng blood vessels kasi malamig. So dapat mag-constrict yung blood vessels to conserve body heat and maintain the temperature of between 35 to 36 degrees Celsius. So yan ang example of these control mechanisms. Now class, these control mechanisms that I have been mentioning are grouped into two. So we have what we call intrinsic controls and extrinsic controls. Now when we speak of intrinsic controls, these are local controls that are inherent in an organ. So meaning automatic siya. Extrinsic controls, on the other hand, involves regulatory mechanisms that are initiated outside an organ. And this is accomplished by both the nervous and endocrine systems. Now, other homeostatic control system also includes the following. So first, we have what we call feed forward. Now, feed forward is a term used for responses made in anticipation of a change. Alright, take note. Responses made in anticipation of a change. Alright, so although not very common in our body, there are certain mechanisms which are activated before a change in a variable actually occurs. These mechanisms attempt to prevent changes before they occur rather than responding to a change after it has occurred. So ina-anticipate na yung magiging changes. Ang tawag dyan ay feed forward. Alright, so feed forward mechanism in the maintenance of balance brings about a compensatory response in anticipation of a change in a regulated variable. In this mechanism, our body gives response prior to signals sent by the brain. So, inuunahan na no, bago pa mag-occur yung deviation. Ayan, example, production of saliva in the mouth, no, when we see the food. So, hindi pa nga natin natitikman yung pagkain, na the brain is already stimulated to produce saliva, no, by the salivary glands sa bibig natin. So by the sight of the food, that is triggered by the brain. The brain then stimulates the salivary glands to produce saliva. So ina-anticipate na masarap yung pagkain, no? Bago pa natin matikman, naglalaway na tayo. So that's an example of feed-forward mechanism. Another example would be the secretion of hydrochloric acid in the stomach when we engulf the food. So paparating pa lang yung pagkain sa tiyan, wala pang pagkain sa tiyan, paparating pa lang o titikman pa lang natin, the stomach already produces hydrochloric acid. So ina-anticipate na yung pagdating ng pagkain. Alright, so that's another feed-forward mechanism, or even the sight of the food, no? Habang tinitigan natin yung lechon, no, medyo nagpo-produce na yung tiyan natin ng hydrochloric acid. Alright, another example of feed-forward mechanism would be drawback of our hand instantly when we touch a hot pot. So ito parang reflex action ito, no? So bigla pag may nahawakan kayong mainit na object, bigla kayong mag-i-retract nyo yung kamay niyo ng mabilis, no? Drawback of our hands instantly. Para hindi na ma-damage yung tissues, di ba? So bigla nyong hahatakin yung kamay ninyo pag nahipon nyo yung isang mainit na object. So that's another example of feed-forward mechanism. So class, I hope there are no questions regarding feed-forward mechanism. Kung may mga questions po kayo, just mag-comment na lang kayo sa ating chat box. Alright? Okay, so again, when we speak of feed-forward mechanism, this mechanism brings about a compensatory response in anticipation of a change or deviation in a regulated variable. Like for example, isang tingin lang ng lechon, naglalaway na kayo. Or isang tingin lang ng isang masarap na pagkain like cheesecake, no? Parang gusto niyo na maglaway. So the production of saliva in the mouth, no, every time we see food is an example of feed-forward mechanism. Hindi pa nga nakakadampi yung pagkain sa bibig ninyo, nagpo-produce na kayo ng saliva. Because saliva plays an important role in the chemical breakdown of food, di ba? So yun, ina-anticipate na yung breakdown ng food. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng feed-forward mechanism. Or ito yung basic example of retracting your hand, no, pag nakahawak kayo ng mainit na bagay. Alright, so ina-anticipate na ng katawan natin kasi baka ma-damage yung tissue, masunog yung mga tissues dyan pag hinawakan ninyo ng matagal. So the body anticipates that by retracting or drawback of our hands instantly every time we touch a hot object. So that's what we meant by feed-forward mechanism. Now another example of a homeostatic mechanism is feedback mechanism. So ano tong feedback mechanism? Now when we speak of feedback mechanism, this refers to responses made after change has been detected. Right? And there are two types of feedback mechanisms. We have negative and positive feedback mechanism. So class, let us now go into the details of these feedback mechanisms, starting with negative feedback mechanism. So again, when we speak of feedback mechanism, this refers to responses made after change has been detected. So let's now go into the details of negative feedback. Now when we speak of negative feedback, the original stimulus is reversed. And most feedback mechanisms or systems in the body are actually negative feedback. And they are used for conditions that need frequent adjustment. Like for example, temperature or even the levels of glucose in our body. Now, in contrast to positive feedback loop, when we speak of positive feedback, the original stimulus is intensified. So take note class, in negative feedback, the original stimulus is reversed. Whereas in positive feedback, the original stimulus is intensified. And this is seen, for example, in childbirth. Now let's go into the details of negative feedback mechanism or the negative feedback loop. So negative feedback loop is composed of the following. So we have the receptor. The receptors are structures that monitor a controlled condition and detect changes. Like for example, in our skin, there are receptors in our skin that detects any deviation or changes in external temperature. Also, we have the control center that determines the next action. Like for example, the nervous system. Alright? And we have the effector. The effector receives directions from the control center like the nervous system, and the effector produces a response that restores, take note, restores the controlled condition. Alright, so everybody kindly take a look at this diagram. So first we have a stimulus. Alright, so the stimulus, for example, changes in temperature is detected by the receptors of our skin. Alright, then these receptors now sends information to the control center like the nervous system. Alright, then the nervous system processes the information and gives instructions to the effectors, either the muscles of the blood vessels that will allow the blood vessels to dilate or to constrict depending on the changes in the external environment like temperature until the normal set values has been restored. Now class, before we move on, let us mention the two communication flows involved in this type of mechanism. So we have what we call afferent flow of communication and efferent pathway or flow of communication. So everybody kindly take a look at this diagram. So again, first we have the stimulus. So for example, the stimulus can be any changes in temperature. So our skin has receptors that can detect these changes in temperature. These receptors will send information to the integrating center or the control center. So this communication flow from receptor to the control center or the integrating center is what we call the afferent pathway. Alright, and from the brain or nervous system, the nervous system will send instructions to the effector, let's say a muscle or a gland. So this communication flow from the nervous system or integrating center to the effector, either to a muscle or a gland, is known as the efferent pathway. So the muscle or the gland may initiate a response in order to restore the normal set values as we have mentioned earlier. So this is what we call a negative feedback. So the negative feedback loop restores the normal changes in let's say changes in temperature or blood pressure. Alright? So again, if communication flows towards the control center from the receptor, so receptor to the integrating center like the brain, you call it the afferent pathway. Alright class? And if information flows from the brain or nervous system to the effector, either muscle or gland, that is termed as the efferent pathway. So class, to further illustrate how negative feedback loop works, let's consider this example of control of blood sugar in our body. So let's say if there is an increase in the glucose levels or blood sugar in our body, that will be detected by the pancreas. The pancreas has receptors that can detect these deviations or changes in our blood sugar. So in this case, tumaas yung blood sugar natin, that would be detected by the pancreas. So there are sensors in the pancreas. So what is involved here is the endocrine system. So the pancreas will send information to the cells in the pancreas itself that will produce insulin. So we call this afferent pathway. So from receptor to the integrating center involved, in this case, the integrating center is the pancreas itself that will produce the needed hormone, which is insulin. So the pancreas will produce insulin to lower down the blood sugar to its normal or set point value. So the insulin that is produced by the pancreas will restore the normal blood sugar level. So this is what we call a negative feedback loop. Alright? So negative feedback loop, the best example of this would be the control of blood sugar. Blood glucose concentrations rise after a sugary meal. Kunyari, kumain kayo ng cake or uminom kayo ng soft drinks. So that's the stimulus. The hormone insulin is released and it speeds up the transport of glucose out of the blood and into selected tissues. So the blood glucose level or concentration decreases to its normal set point value. So class, let's take another look at this example of regulating blood sugar. Favorite ko to kasi yan ang aking sakit. No, I'm a type 2 diabetic. Alright, so let's say you have eaten, let's say, a sugary meal. Kunyari, kumain kayo ng cake or uminom kayo ng soft drinks. This will increase your blood sugar level. So that's the stimulus. rising blood glucose level after eating a sugary meal. So that would be detected by the receptors of the pancreas. High blood glucose levels is detected by insulin secreting cells of the pancreas. So yun yung mga receptors niya. So basically the pancreas will be initiated to secrete insulin. So there are cells in the pancreas that produces insulin, and that insulin is delivered via the bloodstream in order to lower down or to decrease our blood sugar level and restore it to its normal set point value. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop in maintaining our blood sugar level. So before we continue class, let's watch this video about negative feedback loop.
Negative feedback sounds like a bad thing, right? Well, actually, it's not bad at all. In fact, it's a very important process that occurs in our bodies all the time. But what does it actually do? What does negative feedback mean? It's all to do with homeostasis. Homeostasis maintains a constant internal environment so that important functions and processes in the body can be carried out properly. We looked at homeostasis in more detail in this video. Homeostasis stops us getting too hot or too cold and ensures we are breathing enough to bring in sufficient oxygen, and maintains the salt levels within our bodies. Negative feedback is an important type of control that is found in homeostasis, keeping different values around a constant set point. It's a continuous cycle. Very simply put, you get too hot. Your body detects that it's hot. Your body turns on mechanisms to cool itself down. You cool down, the mechanisms are turned off again, and you're back to the start. It's called negative feedback because the stimulus, you being too hot, causes an opposite reaction by the body, so cooling you down. Let's now look at it in a little more detail. Negative feedback involves the hypothalamus, the part of the brain that is responsible for homeostasis. Whether it's temperature, regulation, blood pressure, blood sugar, photosynthesis in plants, it always follows the same steps. A change in a given variable occurs, so either an increase or a decrease. Receptor cells in the body detect this change in a variable. A correction mechanism is then activated, which aims to adjust the variable back to the set point at which it is meant to be, so reversing the change that had occurred. Once the variable returns to the set point level, the correction mechanism stops. It's cyclical and constantly occurring in the body. Now let's look at an example to see what kind of correction mechanisms we have within the body. Different types of stimulus will trigger different responses. We're going to look at blood sugar levels in more detail. We need glucose in our bloodstream for respiration, but too much or too little can be dangerous. This is where negative feedback comes in. When an animal has eaten, blood glucose levels in the body increase. Receptor cells in the pancreas detect this change. This stimulates the release of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that causes the absorption of glucose from the blood, which is changed into glycogen by the liver, where it can then be stored. This causes the blood glucose levels to fall until they return to the set point. This is detected by receptor cells in the pancreas, and the secretion of insulin is stopped. If the blood glucose level then fall too low, this is then detected by different receptor cells in the pancreas, but now a different hormone called glucagon is released. Glucagon stimulates the liver to change glycogen back to glucose, which can then be released into the bloodstream. Blood glucose levels increase again. This change is recognized by receptor cells, and if the blood glucose levels reach the desired set point, the release of glucagon is stopped. Negative feedback is a continuous balancing act. So there we have negative feedback. The important thing to remember about negative feedback is that it's a circle. Some variable changes from the set point, and then we correct it by returning to the set point, which is where we started. To learn.
So class, I hope that short video had been helpful in understanding negative feedback mechanism. So here is another example of a negative feedback mechanism, the regulation of body temperature by the skin. Now, for example, if the body temperature rises above 37 degrees Celsius, yan yun yung stimulus, the skin has receptors that can detect these changes or deviations in temperature. So sa balat natin may mga receptors dyan. And these receptors will send the information to the integrating center, in this case the nervous system sa brain natin. So the pathway from receptors to the brain is called the afferent pathway. Alright, then the brain then processes the information na galing sa mga receptors ng skin natin. Then our brain will send instructions to the effectors. In this case, yung mga effectors would be the muscles of the blood vessels and yung mga sweat glands ng skin. So this pathway from the brain to the effectors is known as the efferent pathway. So in this case, the brain will command the muscles of the blood vessels to dilate. So dilation increases blood flow to the skin, eliminating excess heat. Alright, and also the skin is instructed to produce sweat glands. So sa skin natin may mga sweat glands that produces sweat. So sweating will further lower down the body temperature through evaporative cooling. So basically, homeostasis is restored. The normal set point value is restored. So babalik ulit yung temperature to at least 35 to 36 degrees. So that is a negative feedback mechanism. Alright, so I hope everything is clear. Now what about homeostasis of blood pressure? It's basically the same. So there are baroreceptors in the walls of the blood vessels that can detect any changes in blood pressure. Alright? So the brain then detects those changes kasi may mga receptors nga dun sa blood vessels natin. So the brain receives the information and signals the blood vessels and the heart. So the blood vessels either dilate and heart rate decreases. So your blood pressure decreases. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop in maintaining blood pressure. So class, I hope everything is clear about negative feedback mechanisms. So let us now proceed to positive feedback mechanism. Now when we speak of positive feedback, take note, the original stimulus is further intensified. Ulitin ko. The original stimulus is further intensified. And the best example of that would be the contraction of the uterus during childbirth. So there are stretch receptors in the walls of the uterus and that is sent to the brain. The signals are delivered to the brain. Alright, upon childbirth. Then the brain induces the release of oxytocin into the bloodstream to further stimulate the muscles of the uterus to contract. So uterine smooth muscles contract more forcefully para lumabas yung baby during childbirth. So more stretch, more hormone, more contractions hanggang lumabas yung baby. Alright, the cycle ends with the birth of the baby and decrease in stretch. So that is an example of positive feedback mechanism. So class, I hope everything is clear about homeostasis. So in our next video, we shall study homeostasis in plants.
Control of homeostasis. There are many different feedback control loops in the body, and these homeostatic control systems can be based on positive or negative feedback. The key difference between positive and negative feedback is the response to the change. Negative feedback control loops are the more common of the two, and they respond to a change by helping the body maintain a stable homeostatic condition. An example of this is when the body temperature starts to change. When it's cold out and body temperature decreases below the set point range, which is the normal range that the body tries to stay within, the negative feedback loop will cause the body to shiver, producing heat, and ultimately body temperature will return to within the set point range. The negative feedback loop will do the same if body temperature increases, like during exercise. The negative feedback loop will cause the body to sweat, which will reduce body temperature to within the set point range. Positive feedback control loops do not help the body maintain a stable homeostatic condition. Positive feedback control loops amplify the change that is happening to the body. So let's say that someone has a bacterial infection. The immune system signals the brain to increase the body's temperature set point, causing a person to have a fever. This can be a natural normal reaction. However, in some instances, it could create a harmful positive feedback loop where metabolic rate is elevated and the body is producing heat faster than it can get rid of. So a person may be shivering and sweating at the same time. And if body temperature increases above 108 degrees Fahrenheit or 42 degrees Celsius, it could be extremely dangerous and even fatal. In a couple of instances, positive feedback control loops can be beneficial to the body. Let's say someone gets a cut in a blood vessel wall. A positive feedback control loop begins, and platelets, which are floating around in circulating blood, recognize the damaged area and begin to stick together to slow the loss of blood and patch up the tear in the wall. They also release chemicals that attract more platelets to the area to help stop the blood loss. Eventually a blood clot is formed, the loss of blood is kept to a minimum, and the positive feedback loop ends. And that be the positive and negative feedback in control systems for homeostasis.